Social hour concludes, when the social hour concludes, thank you. What a PI. I know it's Friday. We can accept this. Oh, children. Be happy you're going to college in this era, not in our era. We had people with, oh God, professors at 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, exams, lectures. Okay, spinal cord. And I'm going to go back and use this because I want to do like an EEG for fun in the lab, and I want to get into some eye stuff so we can dissect the eye the following Monday. Okay, spinal cord, vertebral column, all those vertebral arches, and the vertebrae bones. Foramen, and now this is the big part. Number one, begins at the foramen magnum, ends at L1 or L2. You have to understand that the bones elongate much faster than soft tissue. So as it's formed before and at birth, they're the same length, the spinal cord and the vertebral column, but the vertebral column enlarges. The spinal cord does not lengthen as much proportionately. Hence, when adulthood is reached, this only goes down to L1 or L2, and that's extremely significant anatomically. It's the reason we can do lumbar punctures, what you would call, what colloquially refer to as spinal taps. Okay, and yeah, basically, there's nothing, we're not processing here. Effectively, this is all a relay center. So and you're going to see there's a couple of different types of circles. So reflex center, reflexes are initiated and completed. Communication, sensory information going up, motor information coming back down. Terrible illustrations. Sorry. So what you see consistently is areas of enlargement. The cervical area and the lumbar area are both enlarged because they have additional passages going to and from, respectively, the upper cervical and the lower lumbar. You're going to see the way it is divided into what are called plexes, Plexes, the singular being plexus. Those are important. Be thankful. You don't have to go through all the stuff that we used to have to know. I'm just going to give you the major stuff that's associated with it when we get there. The plexes come not so much now, but you're going to see they're going to come a little bit later when we get to peripheral nerves, more so. Maybe some overlap. And again, just like what we learned about when we do the lab preparation, the meningeal layers, we have them here, but they're different. Remember, in the skull, the dura has a component that's on the bone, periosteum, and a portion that's on the brain itself. That's parietal. No such luck here. The dura surrounds the spinal cord. There's nothing adherent to the bone. And that is also very significant vis-a-vis lumbar punctures and something that is not equivalent, okay, which is called an epidural. And epidurals are used most famously, obviously, during childbirth. And again, there's a distinction between an epidural, not that this is a big deal for you at this point in your careers. An epidural is responsible for what's called analgesia, pain relief. When you do a spinal, okay, and you're instilling anesthetic in that is an epidural anesthetic. I beg your pardon, a spinal anesthetic. That's the absence of sensation. Analgesia, absence of pain. Anesthesia, absence of sensation. So there's a very, very large distinction. That's part of this. There's other landmarks, anatomically speaking. So, of course, we have the cervical area, the thoracic for the vertebrae, lumbar, and as we get down here, you're going to see sacral. And what's interesting, where the cord terminates, it's called, remember, the medulla is the internal portion. It's called the medullary cone, and originally in Latin it was called the conus medullaris. So it comes to somewhat of a conical ending. I mean, it's not like a sharp point, but it sort of dovetails into something like that. So that would be the conus medullaris. And then if you look farther down into the sacrum, there's a string-like structure, a little filament called the terminal filament. It goes into the bone itself. It's known as the filum terminale in the Latin, or terminal filament. It's surrounded by meningeal tissue. It's connective tissue, but it anchors the cord because this is the space. Again, you're going to see that's the space where we do lumbar punctures. And interestingly, the nerves still exit at the appropriate area. So the spinal nerves, all of these nerves come down and exit. You know, they normally exit L1 or L2, 3, 4, 5, all sacral roots. They exited all of those, and what that means, okay, that effectively when anatomists had one of these and they teased out all those nerves coming out, even though they're somewhat close together, they look like a horse's tail. So it's called the cauda, which is tail, equine. So those are three anatomical structures that unquestionably will be on the test. You could be a horse's tail, or, but some people are, horse's posterior. The last A&P group at least was laughing at the bad jokes. I don't feel great today. So, spinal dura mater is one layer thick, does not attach. The epidural space, fat and veins between the vertebrae, and that's where you inject. And epidural is a little bit easier injection, comparatively. When you start sticking needles in the area of somebody's spine, you got to know what you're doing. Okay, if you go too deep or not deep enough, it has significant problems. What they're used a lot for is pain relief, and not in people having a baby. A lot of times for chronic pain, and really pain management is a whole subspecialty of medicine. And it's multimodal in the sense that it involves physical therapy, sometimes psychology, pharmacology, all sorts of stuff that are there. Desensitization type things. I have some degree of familiarity with it. A lot of times doing what we call therapeutic blocks. When you inject local anesthetic in something, we call it a block, is the vernacular that's used. So cerebrospinal fluid fills the same space it did in the skull area, in the brain area, the subarachnoid space between the same layers, arachnoid and pia. The dura and arachnoid membranes extend to the sacrum beyond the end of L1 and L2, and that's where we do the lumbar puncture. So this is showing it to you. If you were doing an epidural, it would be in this fatty area. The entry point is from the back. Typically, it's L, and here's, they say filum terminale and cauda equina. But what you're trying to do, this is effectively, it's a needle inside of a needle. This is called, the needle is called a catheter. It's open. And so inside the catheter, it has a hypodermic needle, and it's inserted, and I've never done one, through that relatively firm ligamentous tissue in between the vertebrae and into that space. So you got to know what you're doing, or you can really do some significant damage. The difference is, understand the spinal cord is anchored. So if you go too high, you're going to hit the spinal cord. Here, the forgiveness is because the nerves are not tethered or held in. They will move. So, I mean, you can feel, if you inject somebody, you can feel through it if you're touching something. You feel that little bit of resistance. It's all touching that you get loose. It's a lot of experience. Like I said, I've never done one. I've seen them. Is that a question or a stretch?
Yes, I actually have a question.
Good.
Okay, so, like, I don't know, this might just, like, relate to, like, pain tolerance or something, but why do, like, some people, like, say that, like, I don't know, does that have something to do with, like, the anatomy of the, like, the spine or whatever? Like, whenever they, like, some people say that epidurals, like, don't hurt at all. Like, I hear so many different things about them.
Go ahead and her baby, epidural is very painful. My wife said it was the best thing ever. She only had 5. It didn't bother her at all. She just said, we got every door open.
So like that, like how, what does that like relate to? Is that just like?
Why it hurts technique? And something supposed to help you and doesn't. You know the old thing about real estate, the three things that help to sell real estate: location, location, location. It's in the right place for something. When it comes to procedures you do on people, technique, technique, and technique. Done the right way, you're less likely to fall. And some people are just the notion. Some of the foot patients you get so tense and rigid, sticking a needle.
Yeah.
When I had a spinal tap done. I had developed an infection in my leg. Frankly, I think I had just started to teach you, and I had to stay home for a little bit with that. I mean, the very notion was, but I put up with it. I didn't feel anything at all. I didn't like it. I mean, the fact they gave me a big shot of some kind of, narcotic analgesic probably helped. I was in goofy land. As we used to say back in my day in college, good shit. And that's a joke. Okay. In one of my morning classes, two lovely young gals sit over there, very attentive, good students, A and P. And I mentioned something about, because I reflect back to what it was like when I was in school, well, these many years ago, and it was something along those lines. And I said, because I was in school, I started in school immediately the summer after a thing called Woodstock. I'm sure you heard of it. And they looked at me and going, that aged me 10 years. Are you kidding? I'm like, look it up. So that's where the good fecal material. Give up, Lou. Nobody cares. Nobody thinks you're funny. So you insert that in there, and what happens is this stays in, the metal part stays in. You pull out the plastic syringe and the needle on it, and then you collect tubes of liquid from that. The pressure is such that it'll bring it out. You cut 3 tubes sequentially. When that's done, then you pull it out. It's fraught with difficulty because a lot of people, and this is very serious, a lot of people, my wife's absolute best friend in the world. Okay, she had this done because she'd hurt her back, and they were going to do a myelogram, injecting dye into it. They did the tap; it never healed, and she got to the point where she had spinal hypotension. In other words, the pressure in her cerebrospinal fluid dropped because it leaks, and effectively, what it does, your brain loses the buoyancy, and start to sink in to the foramen magnum. It was a life changer. I mean, she's very hard for her to even get out of the house to this day. This was surely 20 years ago. And I mean, maybe I told you they talk online all the time. It's very hard for her, but she'll go over there occasionally, but the poor lady can hardly get out. Visit people or things like that. Everybody has to come to visit her. It's just sad. And all that and again, it may or may not, maybe it was the technique. My first wife had that done for a back problem. And she had to get a thing called a blood patch, which is one of the ways they try to stop from leaking. I think it was more effective in her. Nevertheless, so here's the conus medullaris and the filum terminale. Denticulate because they look like little teeth. You'll see it. Not a big deal, but this is pia mater. So it's secured more than you think. And then when we get past that, it's a little different because the spinal nerves are not identical, okay, to the bones. I mean, it was fairly easy. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, sacrum, coccyx. Okay, different here. The spinal nerves are technically part of the peripheral nervous system. There are 31 pairs. You're going to see it goes 8. Cervical is an oddball. I don't know if we get to it in this chapter or not. 8 in the cervical, there's theoretically an extra one. 12 for thoracic, 5 for lumbar, 5 for sacrum. If you look at the sacrum we looked at in lab, there's 5 openings for nerves to get through, and even 1 in the coccyx. So 8, 12, 5, 5, 1. be beneficial to remember that. Okay. Quad equina, I said that. Same, here, better illustration. So when a nerve comes out, it's not one piece. It's a combination of what you call these little things, rootlets, ROOTLETS. And so, for instance, it sort of determines if one part of the nerve is, let's say, pinched, why does one part hurt? Why is it only this side? Why do I feel needles and pins on that, burning here, numbness here, etc.? It all depends on what part it is. So it's coming out from all over, but not in one unit. And that explains some of the variations when someone gets sciatica or a pinched nerve. You know, I told you I had a disc that bulged back about 12 years ago. Okay, and I have permanent numbness here. Hasn't affected the function. If I get down on my knees to get something, I can't. I can feel this just fine. This I can't. There's no functional loss. What are you going to do? That part of the nerve was damaged. Can't change it. And so here you see these other things. We'll get to a lot of these structures. And here, this is the conus. Down here, this sort of central layer is the phylum terminale. And this is really what, when they teased it out, it looked like a horse's tail. And that's where it derived its name. I had one of these when I was working at Chatham because I had like a spinal cord and I had a brain. And I mean, we were able to pull this out despite having tons and tons of formaldehyde on it, and showed those were my graduate OT and PT students at Chatham 20 years ago. And then I don't get a lot out of that. There's indentations, as you're going to see in the illustration. So it's not a perfect circle or oval. So basically there's sort of a tiny central gap area, not a big deal. And again, you have the central canal. It's the same arrangement. Fluid on the inside, gray matter, that butterfly that I showed you before, the letter H, and then exterior to that is all white matter. There's no other gray. There's no little islands of gray matter. There's no cortex externally. It's very simple. The gray matter in the middle is all the cell bodies, the nerve, the quote unquote nuclei of all the nerves that are involved receiving or transmitting signals. So here it is. This would be arguably cervical because of that bifid spinous process. And you get the layers that are there. And you're going to see this is a very important arrangement to take a look at. So you have the gray matter are called horns. So you have, and this is posterior because it's the spinous process. You have a ventral horn. Remember, we typically use ventral and dorsal rather than anterior and posterior when we do central nervous system. So you have an anterior horn, or in this case, a ventral horn, and a dorsal horn. And these are called columns, the white matter. And you can see these little openings, a little bit more distinctive anteriorly than posterior. So one's a sulcus and one's a fissure. I never remember which is which. I'm not going to ask you. And so you'll have the dorsal column, you'll have a ventral column, you'll have a lateral column. And you're going to see when we get into the thoracic and lumbar area, we have a little thing that sort of protrudes there. You actually have a lateral horn, which you will see. And sensory nerves are all coming in from the posterior or dorsal aspect, and motor nerves are coming out. But they combine into one nerve. All the sensory nerves coming in, basically, their cell bodies collect here. This is a very important structure to remember called the dorsal root ganglion. Like this is a diagram you'll label for lab. That is a very famous area because if you have a herpes virus, if you have a herpes virus, you have it forever. Where the herpes virus lives, basically lays latent, is in dorsal root ganglia of sensory nerves. And that's why a disease, which is a reoccurrence of herpes called shingles, can occur anywhere, and it follows the line of a sensory nerve. That's what makes shingles. Shingles is very easy and very common. Do you have to worry about it, anybody here? No. 1/3 of us are going to get it anyway. It doesn't matter. So don't worry. There's nothing you can do for it. They have a shot for it when you get older. I never bothered with it. Don't like shots. Yeah, no, don't be. Here you are again, same deal. So a sulcus here, and you can see this thing, a fissure here, because the fissure's a little wider, don't care. Here's that lateral horn, okay? And now you can see the little rootlets, you can see the blood supply, pia adherent, okay, very, just like in the sheep brain, you really can't see the layer. Here's, as you begin to get here, here's the dura, and then the arachnoid, which is really, is almost like a membrane, and again, still with those like gossamer strands that have that spider web kind of an appearance. They're there. So letter H, horns. Basically, what's in those horn areas, okay? Basically, you have motor and sensory nerves. Motor nerves are in that gray matter in the horns, and their axons go out. Okay, sensory nerves, their nuclei, their accumulation, their cell bodies are located, and the sensation is coming in. So understand that you only have 3 kinds of nerves. You have motor nerves, sensory nerves, and the vast majority of your nerves are connectors. The name we give them is interneurons. 90+%, 95, 98% of your nerves are connectors. So it surprises you. It's less about the instruction to do something and the reception of sensation. It's the processing. Why we do based on a sensation, or how we respond to it. All that intricacy that's involved. So as you can see, the lateral horns, thoracic, and the upper lumbar. Remember, it ends pretty soon. And you're going to see that has to do with the autonomic nervous system. We cover that anatomy, interestingly enough, not now, because it's really a physiological system. We do that in physiology. And the gray area, that letter H, is called the gray commissure. The central canal is in there. And really, that's deciding. You saw the roots and the ganglia. This is straightforward reading material. And we don't do this. Okay, you could map this out if you want. I think intellectually, I don't think it's a big deal for us. It's not something I worried about. What we're talking about with, I felt this, or my body said, pick this up because I'm thirsty. Those are somatic. That's my body. I'm getting information from my hand, or I'm sending information to my arm, my hand, to do something. So those are either somatic sensory or somatic motor. Visceral has to do with going on in the interior. And the autonomic nervous system is this visceral motor system. So we'll deal with that separately. And they describe, but these are what I mean by interneurons. Here's a sensory nerve. Here are all the little connectors. And whether it shoots it up or it goes across, and it goes across at different times, which we'll see, but not unlikely to see today. The distinction again. Same thing we learned before. You're not going to see association fibers per se. You're either going to have crossing over commissural fibers or ascending or descending type of fibers that are there. That's really it. So they describe them here, not as projection fibers, but ascending, descending. Ascending is sensory, descending is motor, and transverse or commissural fibers. And then the white matter, I call them columns. Historically, people refer to them as funiculi, with any one of them being a funiculus. Again, you know my fascination with plurals and singulars. It's okay. Everybody's got to have a hobby. So dorsal, lateral, ventral, axons with similar destinations. This is all white matter. Same illustration. Now the tracks. This is a little bit more complex. I just want you to be familiar with it. Okay, I'm going to be, if the questions test-wise would be general questions. Okay, I'm not going to ask you what the spinocerebellar tract does, but I'll do it in presentation. For convenience, they've designated sensory ascending tracts in this shade. That's blue, turquoise. Guys don't do well with color. That's red, descending tracts. The main tracts, remember those pyramids, the pyramidal tracts, are the corticospinal tracts. From the cortex to the spine, those are the pyramidal tracts. They are mostly lateral, and if you follow down, there are some closer to the midline ventral. That is the main tract for the big thing. Move your hand. Grab this with your fingers. That's the main command. The ones that assist the process are these other ones. Again, rubrospinal, vestibulospinal, tectospinal. Don't have to know them. That's med school anatomy, graduate level anatomy. Collectively, and this is not a big deal. Okay, they're called, since they're not pyramidal, we call them outside of or extrapyramidal tracts. And you might have heard me mention to you that a lot of medicines that we use neurologically produce extrapyramidal symptoms. That's really what Parkinson's is. It's unsteadiness in those tracts that are assisting the main commands, but they're not. The message is not clear. So it's a term depending on where your career path is take you. When you hear about, oh, she has extrapyramidal symptoms, or I looked up this medicine, they said something about extrapyramidal complications or have extrapyramidal side effects. That's what it means. Okay, you're going to be doing that, jerking around and stuff like that. It's difficult. I told you, my first wife is lovely. It makes you try her to hold a baby is not easy. Hold to keep baby steady. So those type of things. On the other hand, you have in the sensory aspect of the traps, the ones that convey pain really are major symptoms: hot, sharp, dull, hot, cold, pain. Major symptoms. Okay, major signs rather, or major sensations rather, are the lateral spinothalamics here and here. A little bit less with the ventral, just like the pyramidal tracts. The main body is lateral. There is some ventral. I'm not going into the distinction today. Not part of this. So that's where, and I would remember that, lateral spinothalamics. From anywhere in your spine, it's like, oh, like that. You get that splinter, that's your lateral spinothalamic going, now I got to go dig that out. I was a pro with splinters. True story. Like when I was in the old days, we used to take a sewing pin, sewing needle, and alcohol, and then flame it, and that would be at home. My parents had me taking their splinters out when I was like 8 or 9 years old. A splinter remover was bored. You do that. You have the steadiest hands. Okay. The last kid chosen in any pickup game with steady hands. I digress. And so things like that. Now, remember all of that stuff, all those signals going to the cerebellum, balance, proprioceptors, spinocerebellars. So, I mean, it gives you an idea what these tracks are. I'm trying to acquaint you with them. So, this is the big deal. Again, and I didn't do that number. I'm going to do that when we get into lab on Monday, because that's part of that electroencephalogram, the whole idea of concussions and contusions. In the brain, concussions by definition are transient. Contusions imply more permanently. They're a bruise to the brain. It's flipped. Okay? In spinal cord trauma, contusions are more limited. Concussions tend to manifest themselves as significant damage and permanent damage, interestingly enough. Okay? And why they have that distinction, maybe it's just a funny way they do the names. And remember, I mentioned it to you a little bit when we were in lab. Ryan Shazier, I was teaching this very same class when that happened, and they're going, "Do you think he's ever going to play again?" And I looked at them and I said, "No," because they had said spinal concussion. I mean, I said he'll be lucky if he walks again, and I mean, fortunately, he was able to do so. I mean, because you never know. Years ago, they thought if somebody's paralyzed, that there's a whole lot of sophisticated ways you can deal with it today. They've learned to use certain kinds of steroids to stop the swelling. They used to pack them in ice to reduce the thermal decomposition if something was injured. There's a lot of studies about that. But I knew right away for two reasons. One, they use the word concussion, and two, the only time you can get a player to play is if a doctor clears it, because the insurance company is not going to let that person play, because now you're the ultimate warrior in all of sport, money and everything. There's a guy I follow who's probably the most notable figure in U.S. soccer, not named the manager, but an American in the world of soccer, said it's the old story. You follow the money. So here we are. So leads to this, what I had, a paresthesia. Paresthesias are sensations that are there that ought not to be there. Mind numbness. When your foot or your arm falls asleep, the needles and pins. Those are paresthesias. What diabetics get when they go, oh, my foot feels really cold, and they go, well, I'll just get into it. I mean, it's the worst thing they can do because it feels cold to them, but in reality, it's manifesting difficulties dealing with temperature, and they do things like put it into hot bath water and get a burn. The next thing you know, they have gangrene and goodbye to their foot. Okay? Just giving you some idea. So caused by damage to the dorsal roots of the sensory tracts, sensory function loss, paralysis. Now we're talking motor. Paresthesias are sensory, and it could be complete. Paralysis, okay, motor function loss, and there's two types. Flaccid, the signal is not getting through, versus spastic, the signals getting through are all excitatory. You haven't done the muscle phys unit, but that's the distinction. And it's the old story. When someone has a stroke, it alters the way that nerve, and the nerve effectively just sends out signals that are consistently excitatory. Okay. In the old days, there was a disease that you're all immunized for called polio. Very interesting disease vis-a-vis Pittsburgh, because where was the immunization discovered and finalized? Pittsburgh. A doctor named Jonas Salk. And interestingly, he did it the wrong way. So I was one of at my age, we got the Salk vaccine. As he retired, one of our emeriti, who I think is still around, Norbert, you have to ask Dr. Dressler. He taught here when I was teaching here 20 years ago. He was a medical resident, he was an MD, who actually did the original research. He was on the research team with Jonas Salk in the 50s. When he retired, they discovered, then they realized the virus wasn't spread respiratorily, it's fecal to oral. You get the virus from consuming contaminated water. That's how Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president, got that. And then they gave an oral vaccine. That's the way we get it, not by. And so that was the classic, since it blocked the nerve transmission going to the muscle, flaccid. The muscle got no stimulus. Flaccid versus spastic paralysis. So flaccid, ventral root or ventral horn, that was polio. Don't reach the muscle, no voluntary control, and the muscles waste away or atrophy. Versus spastic, upper motor neurons. You're going to see it's a two-nerve circuit. Nerve from your brain to the spinal cord is called the upper motor neuron. The nerve from the spinal cord to the toe, the finger, the whatever, is the lower motor neuron. Spinal neurons remain intact. Muscles are stimulated reflexly, no voluntary control, and they shorten. And the reason they shorten, again, flexors are always going to overpower extensors. I owe you a muscles. I'm feeling in a bad mood. I'll lecture. Nobody likes you. And so this is what happens when we have the cord damaged. At any level results in total or motor sensory loss in the regions inferior. By definition, if this cord is cut, traumatized, whatever, damaged between T1 and L1, paraplegia, lower extremities. Quadriplegia, upper and lower extremities. There's a matter of degree varies. Cervical region. Spinal shock, transient. This is what happened initially, and then you make the diagnosis of concussion or contusion subsequently. So that's what happens initially when somebody couldn't move. And you see on the sidelines, they can't move in a football game, and all of a sudden, everybody's moving. And then finally, as they get on the stretcher and they start to, thumbs up and start to wave, it's like, oh, moving arms and legs. Sometimes that doesn't happen right away. Back in the locker room, at the hospital, etc. And here's polio, the nugget about polio, almost done. Muscles atrophy, goes to the ventral horn. It enters through your GI tract, but it attacks your nervous system, which is interesting. Death may occur, and typically this was the source of it, respiratory arrest. And I used to see a lot of people with post-polio syndrome because they were born before the vaccine and contracted. Very, very interesting. And the most famous, of the combinations, ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, known as Lou Gehrig's disease. For the famous Yankee ball player, and they really didn't have a name for this disease back when they identified it in 1939. Whatever he was, I think it was 30. And I think the very famous speech was 41. I'll look back on it. It's there. And so they named it after him. He had never missed a game, if you did not know. He took over for a guy named Wally Pipp, who got clunked in the head and played 2,190 consecutive ball games. And then Cal Ripken Jr. eventually broke that record, which the people thought it would stand. It destroys both the ventral horns, the pyramidal tract, and the tragedy of it is brain is intact. You're totally cognizant, but your muscles, your ability to control your muscles, speaking, swallowing, breathing, 5 years, environmental, and we think it involves glutamate. There are treatments that are available now. They are progressing with it. Whether or not these folks, Stephen Hawking, the very famous, the Isaac Newton chair physicist, he had it and lived probably into his early 70s, quite long. So there's been a lot of people historically. That movie with Eddie Redmayne, just go see it. It's brilliant. Won an Academy Award for that. And so it's so. You guys have been in the right age. Have you read Tuesdays with Morrie? And you're in school, in high school. Great book, written by a sports reporter named Mitch Albom from Detroit. And it was about Maury Schwartz, his professor at Brandeis University in Vermont, who developed this. And he went every Tuesday and got life lessons from Maury. And so it was one of those relatively thin, books you could read in a day, and it was required reading for a lot of schools. So just how his relationship and the views on life, knowing that he was going to succumb to all of this. And I think all the proceeds went to research. I mean, he's written the 5 people you most want to meet in heaven. He's written a couple of books like that. Very good author, but very kind of cheeky as a sports writer. But we digress. And here you can see right now. This is about this PowerPoint. Functionally speaking, probably about 8-9 years old. So I don't know what the status of treatments are. All right, we'll stop there before I'm going to go into the pathways and lecture. Next time, we'll get to the lab. We'll do some of the other stuff. Have a great rest of your day. weekend